Hello, and we continue through the Lyon theses, and we've gotten through the international questions where Bordiga said that the Russian party should listen to the rest of the parties in the international for aid in their problems, that the stance towards the Amsterdam conference didn't make a lot of sense and seemed to flip and flop, that there was an over-reliance on the Soviets and did not fully integrate the trade unions more into communist praxis, and he also distanced himself from council communist positions, as well as defining for the first time one of the things that is unique to Bordiga, which is his focus on organic unity and not using discipline to prevent faction bans, but better building the party and increasing the educational apparatus. That last part's going to be an interesting thing. It's one of the things in Bordiga I think is pernicious personally, but nonetheless. Now, here we get to the Italian questions. So let's get into it. This is very much what was on the day in Italy in 1926. Also, if you're new here, this is not the video to start on. Go back and start with the first one. You need the context and the historical debates around what's going on around the Lyon theses. Why are they in Lyon and not in Italy in the first place? What were the parliamentary tactics used to suppress Bordiga? Why did this lead to a suppression of the party? What happened during the fascist period? You need to know some of that stuff to really move forward. So I would go back and listen to the context as well as the first and the introductory documents that we went over and argued with. I actually think it is interesting that this is less strident than a lot of the modern Bordigist defense of it, particularly the most recent one. The one from the 70s was more strident than this, but less strident than the more recent one. So we can see a hardening of the rhetorical line over time here. But anyway, let's get into this. We're in the Italian question section, section 3 of the Lyon thesis. We're about 2/3 of the way through. We'll probably do a few of these at a time, and we should be wrapping this up in a couple more episodes. The Italian situation, 1926. Evaluations of the Italian situation attribute the decisive value to the insufficient development of industrial capitalism are wrong. So what Bordiga is saying is Italy is not got the same problems as Russia. We're not a backwards nation that hasn't had a lot of industrial development yet. Well, the weak expansion of industry in the quantitative sense, along with its relatively late historical appearance, were counterbalanced by a set of other circumstances which allowed the bourgeoisie to completely entrench itself politically during the period of the Risorgimento and develop an extremely rich and complex tradition of government. The political polarities that historically characterized the conflicting parties, such as the old left and right division, clericalism and masonry, democracy and fascism, cannot be automatically identified with the social differences which exist between the landed proprietors and capitalists and the big and petty bourgeoisie. The fascist movement must be understood as an attempt to politically unify the conflicting interests of various bourgeois groups under the banner of counter-revolution. Fascism, created and directly fostered by the entire upper classes, landowners, industrialists, commercial sectors, bankers, supported by the traditional state apparatus, the monarchy, the church, and masonry, pursued this aim by mobilizing elements within the disintegrating middle classes, which, in close alliance with the bourgeoisie as a whole, it managed to deploy against the proletariat. I do think it's interesting that that Bordiga isn't bringing up that the maximalist faction of the socialists is where Mussolini came from and where a lot of the fascist leadership came from. It is actually something that he doesn't mention. So he mentions most of the class content. And you got to give him some credit for that in some ways, because he could make a cheap point here. What has taken place in Italy shouldn't be interpreted as the arrival in power of a new social strata, as the formation of a new state apparatus with a new program and ideology, nor as the defeat of a part of the bourgeoisie whose interests would be better served by the adoption of liberal and parliamentary methods. The Democrats and liberals, the Nitis and Giolitis, are the protagonists of a phase of counter-revolutionary struggle which is dialectically linked to the fascist phase, just as decisive and affecting the proletarian defeat. In fact, it was precisely their concessionary politics, with the complicity of reformists and maximalists, now we got it, which allowed the bourgeoisie to resist the pressure from the proletariat and head off during the post-war period of demobilization at precisely the time when every component of the dominant class was unprepared for a frontal attack. Directly favored in this period by governments, the bureaucracy, the police, the judiciary, army, etc., fascism has since gone on to completely replace the bourgeoisie's old political personnel. However, we shouldn't be fooled by this, and neither should it serve as a reason for rehabilitating parties and groups who were removed not because they achieved better conditions for the working class, but because for the time they had completed their anti-proletarian task. I realize these are theses in the context of a polemic delivered at a Congress, so we can't ask for a whole lot more detail, but I would like to have more details on what Bordiga is specifically thinking here. All right. 2. Political positions of the communist left. As the above situation was taking shape, the group which formed the Communist Party set out with these criteria: a break from the illusionary dualisms of bourgeois and parliamentary political scene, and an affirmation of the revolutionary antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Propaganda amongst the proletariat aimed at destroying the illusions that the middle classes were capable of producing a political general staff and of taking power and clearing the way for proletarian victories, instilling confidence in the proletariat in its own historic task through propaganda based on a series of critical political and tactical positions which were original and autonomous and solidly linked through successive situations. The tradition of this political current goes back to the left wing of the Socialist Party before the war. While a majority capable of struggling both against the errors of reformism and the syndicalists, the latter having been personified the proletarian left until then, was formed at the Congress of Reggio Emilia in 1912 and Ancona in 1914, an extreme left aspiring to be even more radical classist solutions, which also emerged within the majority. Important problems for the working class were correctly resolved during this period, namely with regard to the question of electoral tactics, links with trade unions, colonial war, and Freemasonry. During the World War, virtually the entire party opposed of the Union Sacrée politics, and at the successive meeting and congresses, Bologna, May 1915, Rome, February 1917, Florence, November 1917, Rome 1918, its extreme left wing, now clearly differentiated, defended the following Leninist positions: the rejection of national offense and defeatism, exploration of, don't pick a side in war, hope both sides lose, exploration of military defeat to pose the question of power, an unceasing struggle against the opportunist trade unions and parliamentary leaders, along with the call for their expulsion from the party. Immediately after the war, Il Soviet became the mouthpiece of the extreme left and the first newspaper to support the policies of the Russian Revolution and to confront anti-Marxist, opportunist, syndicalist, and anarchist misinterpretations. It correctly set out the essential problems of the proletarian dictatorship and the party's task, and from that very start defended the necessity of a split in the Socialist Party. This is actually part of what led to the birth of the Italian Communist Party. This same group supported electoral abstentionism, but the Second Congress of the International would dismiss its conclusions. Its abstentionism, that's where part of where left-wing communism and infantile disorder comes from. Its abstentionism, however, didn't derive from any anti-Marxist theoretical errors of the anarcho-syndicalist type, as its resolute polemics against the anarchist press have shown. The application of abstentionist taxes was recommended above all for a fully developed parliamentary democracy because this political environment creates particular obstacles to winning over the masses to an accurate understanding of the word dictatorship, difficulties which, in our opinion, continue to be underestimated by the International. In the second place, abstentionism was proposed at a time when huge struggles were settling and even huger mass movements. I think that's huger. It says hugger sick, but I want to read as huger. huger mass movements into motion, unfortunately not the case today, and not as a tactic applicable for our times and all places. With the 1919 elections, the bourgeois Nedi government opened up an immense safety valve to the revolutionary pressure and diverted the proletarian offensive and the attention of the party by exploiting the tradition of unbridled electoralism. Il-Soviet's abstentionism was entirely correct, and in that it responded to these true cases of proletarian disaster that ensued. The subsequent Bologna Conference, October 1919, only the abstentionist minority posed correctly the question of a split with the reformists, but it sought in vain to come to agreement with the section of the Maximalists on this point, even after abstentionism had been renounced in order to achieve it. The attempt failed. The abstentionist faction remained the only section of the party which, up until the Second World Congress, worked on a national scale for the formation of a communist party. This was therefore the group which represented the spontaneous adherents, setting out from its own experience and traditions of the left of the Italian proletariat to the policies of Lenin and Bolshevism, which had lately emerged victorious in the Russian Revolution. Section 3. The work of the party's leadership. Within the new Communist Party, constituted at Leghorn in January 1921, the abstentionists made every effort to forge solid links with other groupings in the party. But while for some of these groupings, it was the international relations alone which necessitated a split from the opportunists, the abstentionists, who for discipline's sake had expressly renounced their positions on elections, and indeed for many other elements besides, it was because of the theses of the International and the lessons of the recent political struggles, which were completely consistent with each other. In its work, the interpretation of the Italian situation and the tasks of the proletariat mentioned earlier inspired the party leadership. With hindsight, it was clear that the delay in the formation of a revolutionary party, for which the other groups were responsible, made the subsequent proletarian retreat inevitable. In order to place the proletariat in the best position during the ensuing battles, the leadership took the stance that although the greatest effort should be made to use traditional apparatus of red organizations, it was also necessary to win the proletariat not to count on anything from the Maximalists and Reformists, who would even go so far as accepting a peace treaty with fascism. From its inception, the party defended the principle of trade union unity, going on to propose the central postulate of the United Front, which culminated in the formulation of the Labor Alliance. Whatever opinions one might have about the political United Front, the fact is that the situation in Italy in 1921 to 1922 made it an impossibility. In fact, the party never even received any invitation to attend any meetings aimed at founding an alliance of parties. The party didn't intervene at meetings to constitute trade union alliance called by the railway workers because they didn't want to lend itself to maneuvers which might have compromised the alliance itself and which might have been blamed on the party. It had already shown beforehand that it approved of the initiative by stating that all communist workers in the new organization would observe discipline towards it. Certain contacts between political groups would eventually take place. The Communist Party wouldn't refuse to take part, but they would come to nothing, demonstrated both the impossibility of arriving at an understanding on the terrain of political action and the defeatism of every other group. During the retreat, the leadership was able to preserve the confidence of the workers in their own class and raise the political consciousness of the vanguard by heading off the traditional maneuvering of the pseudo-revolutionary groups and parties within the proletariat. Which one specifically, Bordiga? Despite the efforts of the party, it was not until later, August 1922, that a general mobilization took place, but the proletarian defeat was inevitable, and from then on, fascism, supported by the violent campaigns by force of the declared liberal democratic state, became the master of the country. The March on Rhone happened afterwards, merely legitimized fascism's predomination in the formal sense. Even now, despite reduced proletarian activity, the party's influence still predominated over the Maximalists and Reformists, its progress having already been demonstrated by the 1921 election results and the extensive consultations that took place within the Confederation of Labor. Section 4. Relations between the Italian left and the Communist International. The Rome Congress, held on March 1922, brought to light a theoretical divergence between the Italian left and most of the International. A divergence expressed before, rather badly, by our delegates at the Third World Congress and the enlarged executive of February 1922, where, especially on the first occasion, errors of a leftist nature were committed. Fortunately, the Rome thesis constituted the theoretical and political liquidation of any peril of left-wing opportunism in the Italian party. The only difference in practice between the party and the International was about the tactics to follow with regard to the Maximalists. But the Unitarian victory at the Socialist Congress in October 1921 appeared to have settled this. The Rome theses were adopted by the party's contribution to the International's decision-making, not as an immediate line of action. This was confirmed by the party directorate at the enlarged executive of 1922, and if no theoretical discussion took place there, this was because of a decision by the International, which for discipline's sake the party complied with. In August 1922, however, the International wouldn't interpret the Italian situation in the same way as the party directorate, but concluded that the situation in Italy was unstable in terms of weakening state resistance. It therefore thought that a fusion with the Maximalists would strengthen the party, considering the split between the Maximalists and Unitarians as decisive and opposed to the party directorate that wished to apply the lessons learned during the vast strike maneuver in August. It is from this moment that the two political lines diverge in a definitive way. At the Fourth World Congress in December 1922, the old leadership opposed the majority thesis, and on returning to Italy, the delegates would pass the matter to the Commission, unanimously declining to take any responsibility for the decision, though of course retaining their own administrative functions. Then came the arrest in February 1923 and the big offensive against the party. Finally, the enlarged executive of June 1923 would oppose the old executive and replace it with a completely different one. Several party leaders would simply resign as a logical consequence. In May 1924, a party consultative conference still gave the left an overwhelming majority over the center and the right, and thus arrived at the Fifth World Congress in 1924. And we'll stop here because the next section is pretty long. This is a lot of particular Italian context, and it's something you need to know. Let's talk a little bit about the Maximalists. The Maximalists were generally considered one of the center-left factions of the Italian Socialist Party. And they would form their own party in 1930 after the old Italian Socialist Party was more or less dissolved. They produced Benito Mussolini. They were also a group somewhat close to the left faction in the Socialist Party in the very early days, but there was more and more divergence between them. And the Maximalists were pushing for a maximum program as opposed to the reformist. But they were still fairly within the socialist, limits. They weren't necessarily pushing for a revolutionary insurrection. So that's one of the differences. And it's going to come up a lot. So in the Italian case, you have the new order or the center, you have the maximalist, you have the reformist, and you have the left faction. The left faction is going to be split eventually into two categories in the 1950s. Those who followed Dement, and those who followed Bordiga. The Dement faction, I think, was actually a little larger than the Bordiga faction. But the Maximalists also have a kind of taint on them because of their collaboration with National Syndicalists and the beginnings of fascism, and that Mussolini came from their ranks. All right, we'll stop here and we'll come back for a few more sections on these very soon. Take care. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. We have a Patreon, and I hope all is well with you. Remember to keep your peace as best as you can.